Hello and welcome to the 809th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Before we begin, I want to extend a warm welcome to students joining us from Princeton University and Mercy University, as well as members of the 2025 class of fellows, a select group of diverse, rising, next-gen business thought leaders. The Economic Club is proud to stand as the nation's leading platform for discussions on social, economic, and political issues, and we've been doing this for more than a century. Joining us today is a very special speaker. As part of our author series, we have Christina Hillsberg to discuss her book, Agents of Change, The Women Who Transformed the CIA. In this very powerful work, she uncovers the hidden stories of the women who revolutionized America's most secretive agency. She's a former CIA intelligence officer, writer, and recognized expert on women in espionage and intelligence tradecraft. The recipient of multiple CIA Exceptional Performance Awards, her work at the CIA included specializing in African politics and leaders as one of the intelligence community's few Swahili and Zulu linguists, producing analytic assessments for senior level policymakers, including the president and his cabinet, and serving in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, clandestinely collecting intelligence from the field. After leaving the CIA, Christina worked in information security at Amazon, where she stood up the company's first insider threat program. She created a new global framework to analyze cyber risks, something that we're all interested in, and established new processes to utilize intelligence tradecraft to analyze information security threats. She now writes full-time and is the author of License to Parent: How My Career as a Spy Helped Me Raise Resourceful, Self-Sufficient Kids. Her writing's been featured in the Washington Post, the Seattle Times, the Harvard Business Review, Parents Magazine, Thrive Global Parade, and more. Today's program is a fireside chat. We're honored to have club member Anna Nikolayevsky, founder and CIO of Axel Capital, as our moderator. In addition, we'll be using the chat box for the conversation. You can enter questions directly into the box for their consideration, time permitting. As a reminder, this discussion is on the record. We do have some media on the line, and we'll end promptly at 12:45 p.m. So now, without further ado, I'm happy to pass the time over to you, Anna, to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Christina, thank you for doing this. I've been interested in the CIA ever since I read the book Harlot's Ghost by Norman Mailer many years ago. So thank you. So can you tell me what inspired you to write Agents of Change?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for joining today. I was inspired to write Agents of Change because there are so many misconceptions about the female spy. We see these depictions of her in Hollywood. We see James Bond, and then we see the Bond girl, who has often for decades been mere arm candy to James Bond. Even her names were often a punchline: Holly Goodhead, Pussy Galore. And so what I realized after having left, that on the outside world, there's really a lack of understanding of what women intelligence do. I mean, just recently I was talking to a young woman who's going into college, very bright young woman who's considering a career at the agency, who told me that she wasn't sure if she could sleep with strangers. And I was very shocked and said, well, why would you need to do that? And she said, well, I know that's what the CIA will ask me to do. And I share that because I think that's such an important anecdote as to why we need a book like this even in 2025, right? Because the real women of the CIA were very accomplished. They didn't use sex to collect intelligence, and don't. And, often their stories are overlooked, not shared. I like to say you can't throw a rock without finding a memoir from a man with his espionage war stories, but women are much less likely to share their own stories. And so I felt that I was uniquely positioned, having the bona fides of working there and having those connections, to have that trust of women who wouldn't ordinarily be willing to share their story with a traditional journalist. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to conserve their experiences for the historical record and amplify women's voices.
So what qualities or traits make women advantageous spies?
You know, it came up time and time again in my interviews. I interviewed dozens of women for this book, and go more in depth on specific ones that I've chosen to be our sort of characters throughout the book. And there are some traits that come up, and the first being that we are underestimated. That speaks more to, you know, the environment than women ourselves, but that's something that we've been able to leverage to our benefit. And a wonderful example of this is Marty Peterson, who was the first woman to operate clandestinely in Moscow in the 70s. And she was able to conduct dead drops for an asset, the most important asset in station, for months, right under the noses of the KGB, because it never dawned on them that the CIA would be using a woman in that capacity, which is remarkable, right? And of course, station management thought that she must just not be seeing them. You know, she wasn't running good surveillance detection routes. She's a woman. She's missing something. They even sent a man to like double check to make sure she was, you know, not just missing them, right? And lo and behold, that was the case. And she was right. And I do go into Marty's story in the book, which is so inspiring. And when the asset was compromised, there was a lot of thought that it was her fault, and she had to live with that for 7 years before it came to light that, you know, he was compromised in such a way that had nothing to do with her. And so I share that because there's so much tied with societal expectations. So that's number one. We can operate, you know, we're underestimated. We can operate under the noses and kind of fade into the background. I've also had women tell me that assets are often more comfortable sharing with a woman handler because if they're men, they don't have that pressure to out-impress their male handler. Sometimes they find women more nurturing, more empathetic, and also, I mean, some of these sound like wild generalizations, but I will tell you that once you hear them over and over and over from women, right? Like that anecdotal evidence becomes very strong. And that is things like women are better listeners. We pick up on details that our male colleagues often miss when they're looking at surveillance, particular socks and shoes and things that, you know, they feel that their male colleagues would miss. At the same time, there are those advantageous qualities. There are also challenges that come along with it. You know, women would talk to me about what they would do to make sure there were clear boundaries so that assets would know, you know, that this was a professional relationship. And it was everything from I would dress, you know, as unattractive as possible and wear very little makeup, to another woman telling me if it was a hotel meeting, I would make sure we were never in line of eyesight of the bed, because we hold a lot of, you know, intelligence meetings, ops meetings in hotel rooms, right? And so making sure the bed wasn't in line of sight. So things like that, you know, women also have to balance.
So the term sisterhood is often used to describe relationships between early female spies. And based on your experience as a spy organization and your interviews with dozens and dozens of women across generations, do you think that's an accurate description?
You know, I will say that when we submitted this book to publishers, it had the word sisters in the title because we really wanted to show that it's a celebratory book. Like the tone was one of cautious optimism, wanting to celebrate the progress women have made through the decades and the agency has made, while not shying away from some of the less favorable moments. But as I dug into the research, of course, I had my own experience there, but the more and more women I interviewed, I walked away with, wow, sisterhood, it is not an accurate reflection of what life has been like at the agency throughout the years. Of course, there are pockets where women would work together and help each other. But when it first started in the 60s, well, the period that I'm looking at in the book, when we look at in the 60s and those early years, women were often very isolated. There were very few of them. Women started going to the farm, very early, right? And I talk about some women who went down to the CIA's covert training facility, the farm, in those early classes. And there were often, 9 women in a class of 90, right? There were so few. And then of those 9, only 1 or 2 would actually go into the Directorate of Operations, and maybe 1 or 2 would be lucky enough to get a field assignment. And if they went out to a station, they were usually the only woman there. There was no instant message to talk to a woman in a different station or back at headquarters. There was no email, right? So a lot of those divisions were logistical early on. But then because it was such a difficult environment, you had women proving themselves and trying to, find that success. And you started to see in the 80s this idea of, well, we had to go through it. We paid our dues, and
Yep.
these younger women have to do it too, right? This idea of them forgetting to send the elevator back down. Right. And so we do still see some of that, surprisingly, to this day. And that came up quite frequently. And that's not to say that there weren't other groups. At the end of the 80s, there was the formation of the DO, Directorate of Operations, Women's Advisory Council. So you did kind of start seeing things, right?
Mhm.
But by and large, I wouldn't call it a sisterhood then. I think I have felt something like that after having left. And I think a
Okay.
lot of women feel that because once you're out of that world where it's very sharp elbows, type A, everyone is trying to move up quickly, right? And there's almost like this scarcity complex, especially for women, that there's not enough room for us at the top. We have to act like men to get to the top, right? But then once we're out of that, you meet these women and you share this unique, incredible bond having been a part of that world. So I do feel those connections now. And that's been probably the most rewarding part of writing this book, is meeting all of these women across generations and forming friendships because of that unique bond. But at the CIA, not so much.
So what's turnover in the CIA amongst women compared to men? Do you know?
They won't share those numbers. They will not share publicly retention,
Okay.
like hard numbers, but I can tell you that when you look at them, there is a clear retention problem, particularly with women and women of color. I will say minorities, men or women, but particularly women of color. And that was a challenge writing the book, finding women of color to interview. And there's only a couple that I was able to. And anecdotally, I mean, almost everyone, myself included, my husband included, who's a former case officer, we were racking our brains to think if we knew a single Black or any woman of color operations officer, and neither of us did. And so I was able to interview a few, and it was really illuminating because one woman in particular, who I share her story in the book, and I found her because one of the women I profiled deeply is a woman named Janine Bruckner, who passed away before I began my research. And so I really had to dive in to interview, as many people as I could who knew her intimately to create this picture of her. And so I came across this woman who I call Angela in the book. It's not her real name, but she did pick that pseudonym for Angela Bassett. And I just think it's incredible. I have to share that. She knew immediately what she wanted her pseudonym to be. And so when I spoke to her, she was there a little less than 10 years, and it was in the 80s. And she said, you can have an experience that's 85% good, but that 15% starts to wear on you. And she shared some of those experiences, which I include in the book. And I understand why she made the decision to leave. And I can't help but wonder how many incredibly talented women like Angela the agency has lost because they have not fostered the type of environment that keeps that talent, right? It's not enough to recruit diverse talent. And I can speak more to that because things are changing, as we know, this year. But you also have to retain that talent. Otherwise, it's going to walk out the door to a more inclusive environment. And we've seen a lot of that.
So you shine a light on the CIA's current dilemma that it's facing when it comes to mishandling of sexual harassment and assault. Were you surprised to hear these instances, and is the agency working to fix that?
Surprised, yes and no. I think from a cultural standpoint, I wasn't surprised. It's very similar with what I experienced during my time there. I think the part of it that was surprising was the fact that I could sit down with a woman in her 80s and she could share a story of sexual harassment, from the 60s or 70s. And I could nod my head knowingly when she explained, and this is in the book, a woman named Lucy Kirk, and hearing her, like, the judgment of herself saying, I'm sure I didn't say you disgusting pig. I'm sure I nodded and smiled, and as she's telling me this, I am feeling it like deeply because I know exactly what she means, because you have a culture that's long been dominated by men. Okay, but you also add a layer of complexity, which is this secrecy and working undercover, and that makes it so complex. And there's been this environment of women, not speaking up because the belief, rightfully so, is that it would be career suicide. But what we've seen in the last several years is that this new generation has a different energy surrounding equality and speaking up, which is fantastic. And so, thanks to a few brave women who shared their stories with Congress, we now have the Intelligence Authorization Act, which establishes congressional oversight, requires the agency to create a reporting mechanism for that, because you saw a lot of the agency handling things internally and discouraging employees from going to law enforcement, making threats of, if you go, that's a federal crime because you're blowing your cover and the other officers' cover, right? So now that Congress is involved, I think we've seen some progress. That said, it's measured progress. I think there's a long way to go. And again, this gets back to keeping that talent in the building and from walking out the door. And the first step to that is making sure it's a safe environment for your employees, particularly when they're in your own building with their colleagues. Safety, I mean, that's baseline, that's basic needs, right? And so we need them to take more concrete steps, take it seriously, hold assailants accountable. So we're getting there. I applaud them for the steps that they've taken, but I like to say it's like steering the Titanic, because I mean, we're looking at an entrenched culture where this has been the norm for so many years. And the current atmosphere, I will say, since January, has made for an environment where, unfortunately, even those brave officers who have been speaking up in the last few years no longer feel safe to do so. So we're seeing some backtracking, unfortunately.
Does the environment actually change that greatly from administration to administration?
Not ordinarily.
Okay.
I think, we pride ourselves at the agency of being apolitical. You serve whatever administration is elected. People have asked me if on this book tour, politics of my colleagues. And I said, I never knew the politics of my colleagues. We didn't discuss US politics. We weren't allowed to.
Yep.
And, we talked more about African politics than American politics, right? That was our job. And informing US policymakers about our regions, right? But because of like the DEI rollbacks, it's really impacted the culture and the atmosphere. I mean, an officer recently told me that the energy at headquarters feels like a funeral, and that it's very somber, and that there's a lot of fear in the environment. I have many friends who've lost their jobs because they were on rotation to the diversity office. They were not diversity officers, like they were just, they reached the point in their career where they were so senior that you need to have, an out-of-body experience or a rotation. And that happened to be where they were on rotation. And rather than closing the office and pulling those extremely talented and exceptional officers back to their home offices, they were let go. And so now we're looking at not just a lack of diversity in the coming months and years, but a serious brain drain of some of our most talented and exceptional officers. And I'm talking people that I would have envisioned as director or deputy director of the agency one day. That's the kind of talent that we have lost in the last few months.
Wow. Can you discuss any ethical dilemmas that you faced when you were in the CIA? What stays with you? What can you discuss?
I think that is certainly always part of the job, particularly in operations. I started my career on the analytics side, And because I'm a writer and a researcher at heart who absolutely loves Africa and African languages. And so I fell into the operational side for lots of different reasons, and found that I really enjoyed it and was good at it. And so, when and my husband always says it's like there are these stereotypes about analysts versus operations officers. And the old school one is that like the analysts are shoegazers and don't have social skills, right? And then, of course, the people in the DO are just so much, suave and cool and all those things, right? But if you're an analyst who has all the research skills and you also have social skills, it's kind of like a superpower to then go into ops, right? And so I really enjoyed it. But the ethical stuff comes up a lot, right? Because it is a career where you are assessing people's vulnerabilities. You are looking for their motivations. And so there are really, you have to be able to live in the gray. And that's not something that analysts do very well. And so for me, that was a really big transition. And so you're always kind of looking at things with an eye of national security and what, do the ends justify the means? I will say, obviously all operations, we're always working with the agency lawyers, right? And so there's always, from that standpoint, you're considering those things. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions, particularly, I will say, with Edward Snowden, for example. This is a great anecdote. My husband actually served a tour with him in the same station. And when it came out, he looked at the TV and said, "Oh my God, it's Ed." And, one of the things that he had shared was this like absolutely absurd story about an op that they were doing at that station, that they were going to like blackmail the target, and they were going to work with that particular government to like threaten him. And it was this whole thing. And my husband was like, "This is absolutely absurd. One, we don't work with that government. We don't have a good liaison relationship. We would never do that. And two, we do not blackmail our assets. Like that is not the CIA's playbook. Like there's no honeypots. There's no like blackmailing. It's not what we're seeing in the movies. Sure, there are other foreign intelligence services that do those things. But I will say that I know there are controversial views about the CIA and there are parts of history that maybe are not as favorable. But I will say my time during there, like we do operate at such a high level of integrity and the ethical issues. So there's living in the gray, but we are the good guys, right? And there are so many examples of like when assets pass away, the lengths that we will go to find their family to make sure that they are compensated, right? Because some assets will, they can't receive all their payment because it would raise a flag and we want them to be safe in their country. And so sometimes their payments will be kept in like a special account, right? And those assets, if they pass away, like we will find, whoever they are, like there are so many examples. So the ethical stuff, it comes up all the time. It's the nature of the beast. But I think that we do a really great job to balance that.
Okay. So how has technology changed the role of a CIA agent? And has it become more complicated given all the transparency and similar technologies across the board?
Yes, it's changed the landscape for sure, but I think true espionage is, off the grid, not with the technology. But of course, you have to think about how it impacts things, right? Like more video cameras on streets, how does that affect your operations? Biometrics, right? If you've traveled somewhere in alias and they have biometrics, well, guess what? You're not going back to that country under true name, right? So there are things to consider, but at the same time, there are also advancements in technology that will make some parts of espionage easier for us as well. So, right, it comes with the benefits and challenges. I think in terms of recruiting the next generation of officers, I think that comes with its own challenges because you have a generation that grew up with the internet, right? And so how do you explain to these young people that, hey, this is a job where you're not going to have your phone for 12 hours a day. You're not going to have access to social media. You need to think about what you can post. You can't live your whole life online, right? There are so many different lifestyle changes. And so the question is, how do you make a career like this appealing for people who have grown up in a very different world using technology and opening up themselves in a way that we never had before. And so lots of challenges to consider.
So how long is the actual recruiting process? How long does it take? And how long is the training? Like what's the trajectory of, what's the
Well, it
path?
can
Like if you were an
vary.
investment bank and had an analyst program.
It can vary. Most people have to wait about 12 to 18 months for their security clearance to go through.
Mhm.
If you are young and a child bride to the organization, like I was at 21 with very little overseas experience, it can be much faster. And the stars aligned for me, and I was literally in the door 4 months later, which is unheard of. Unheard. Like I don't know anyone else that it's gone that fast. I happened to already be in the area, and there was a spot at the last minute once I cleared, and so that's unusual. And
Mhm.
then you go in and it does vary according to directorate, lots of different training. If you're on the analytics side, you're in several months of that type of training. If you're on the DO side, you have several months at the farm. And depending on what path you come in at, even in the DO, you might have a couple years at headquarters before you go to the farm officially. And during that time, you do rotations on different, in different areas, in different divisions, and kind of get sort of like a preview of everywhere in the agency before you go to the farm. So it can vary according to, a year or two before some people will go out into the field, or, if someone has very specific skills that are needed, it could be fast tracked. So the agency answer for a lot of things is it depends.
Okay. And is that also true for which countries are considered to be more favorable or more desirable career-wise?
Yeah, you mean going there, or what do you
Yes,
mean?
that's going.
Yeah, it will vary. And of course, the agency's always reorganizing depending on the directorate. And around the time that I left, they organized these mission centers and got rid of home basing. But it used to be that you were home based in a division and then your tours were, according to that division. But I know it's changed now. And so, yeah, some places are more sought after than others. And there are also some places, like particularly working on Africa, there are a lot more opportunities for more junior officers early on, and you're covering a lot more area of, and you have more responsibility as opposed to having like a sliver of the pie if you're working on China or Russia, right? So that's another reason why I'm biased, but I think Africa was the best, the best part to work on. Although I heard last night I had an event at Politics and Prose with Valerie Plame, and she was saying that she had heard that there's been talk of closing all of the sub-Saharan Africa mission,
Wow.
like in the next year. And like
What
that,
would be the reasoning behind that?
I don't know. And so I've been meaning this, it was late last night and I haven't been able to read up on it, but like that would be devastating. I mean, we are already behind, China in particular on the continent. Uh, and if we were to close those missions, I mean, that would be a complete vacuum for them to continue to fill, right? We're already behind, and like, I just can't imagine. And of course, like as someone who just loves that part of the world, and I think it's so important to have experts looking at those parts of the world and in those missions so that we can educate our policymakers, because I think we can all agree that there are many parts of the world that our US policymakers need experts, providing that expertise and background for them to learn those areas. I think it would be devastating. I mean, and we're already seeing the closing of USAID. There are so many programs that the US does to develop that relationship of trust and influence in a region that I think, that soft power is just as important. So I hope that doesn't happen.
So what habits when you were in the CIA still shape your daily thinking or decision making today, now that you've moved on to the corporate world and become a writer?
I think a lot of it shapes our parenting style, which I wrote about in my previous book, making sure that we expose our kids to a variety of interests. The thing about being a case officer is that the more interesting you are and the more skills and experiences you have, the more likely it is that you can find a common interest with a target or an asset so that you're genuinely connecting with them. And a lot of case officers will tell you that they do develop genuine friendships with their assets. Now, you could argue, is it genuine if, there's always a motivating factor. There's always a goal, right? You're always trying to get information from them. So how genuine is it? But, again, living in the gray. So I think exposing our kids to a variety of interests to make them interesting and worldly and looking at a holistic approach as opposed to being like all academics and skills and that sort of things. Like we want our kids to know archery and, liberal arts and, sports and chess and poker and all these things, right? So that's really important, exposing them to different parts of the world, geographically as well. So I think that comes up daily for me. Of course, from a security standpoint, I'm always thinking about different things from, routes I take, being aware, as a woman in particular, at night or different environments and just being aware of my surroundings. I keep that with me for sure. And I think traveling internationally, it still helps me. But you can kind of turn things on and off, I think. And we all kind of, and I talk about this in the book too, this particularly for women who were in for much longer than I was, the ability to kind of feel and be normal after learning how to suppress emotions. One woman in particular, I share the story of how her asset brought her the severed head of a terrorist in the trunk of his car because he was so proud of it and wanted to show it to her, right? And so she talks about how she had to learn this ability to manage her emotions and deal with instances like that and, some different bombings and things that went on. And so she talked about the struggle of leaving that world. She's only retired in the last few years and feeling normal. And I don't know that there is because
normal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's obviously been an increase in the conflicts globally in the last 5 years, I would say. Do you think that there's an increase in the number of spies that are entering the United States?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think there certainly could be. There are always so many more, than we realize, right? And they're operating, right under our noses. Being in Washington, D.C., crawling with spies from all over the country, right? And New York, you've got the UN. I don't know that there are more now. I think there always are. And then you go somewhere like Geneva, Vienna. Same instance in those places, right? You have lots of espionage going on. And I think there's also this idea because of the movies that it's all done in private. But listen, there are ops meetings going on, people, you don't even know it, because it's often in a restaurant. Yes, we do hotel debriefings, but you're also meeting your asset in a restaurant and people will hear this and they're thinking, well, that's not accurate, that whatever. No, that is it is happening all around you.
Right. We have some audience questions. Can you talk about the CIA in Africa, given that that's your area of specialty? And how does the CIA deal with the Wagner group in particular?
Well, I can speak to a little bit about the CIA in Africa. From my experience, I think really, like I was mentioning, it is a great place to be as an analyst or the DO because you get more responsibility, but also there are a variety of what we call hard targets there from other countries. So you're serving in Africa, but maybe you're not going after African sources. You're going after Chinese, Russian, because there are, like I said, those countries, they're filling our vacuum and building roads where we could be building roads and all of those other things economically. But we, by and large, are doing a lot of hard target work, a lot of counterintelligence work there, which can be, very instrumental because those types of cases can take years to develop. And so I think it's a really crucial aspect of our work, and being able to do it in countries like that, I think is really vital. So that, I would say, is a huge part of what we see there. And I can't speak specifically to how they deal with the Wagner Group.
Did you have a mentor internally? And what advice would you give to young women thinking about joining the CIA?
I did have several mentors. That was something the agency was very good at when I was there, at least on the analytics side. I think it's very different on the DO, but I did have some formal mentors who were assigned to me, but then also just sort of more organic relationships, and actually still maintain some of those even after having left. And those were very, very important to me. And I know that there are women who have made it to senior levels who really do seek out and try to mentor other more junior officers. It's not as common as I wish it was. Um, Young women who want to join now, I think the biggest message that I would say to them is we need you. We need you in national security. This book hasn't, didn't exist for women joining, years ago. It's here now. You can read about all the women who've come before you and everything they've done to open these doors, whether they reached down and grabbed you up or not, they still made those, there were still these watershed moments that we're all able to benefit from. And so I think having that information going in eyes wide open is key. But women are vital to national security, and our country is weaker without them. We need diversity of thought at the agency, diversity of experience, linguistic, cultural diversity, all of these things, right? And so, yes, there have been difficult times in the agency's history. Yes, there's still work to be done, but we still need you. We need to keep, this talent inside the building. We need to continue to bring it in and keep them in the building because we are such important parts of our national security.
Can you talk a little bit about how the CIA pursues short-term versus long-term goals? Can you give any examples?
Let's see. Yes, I mean, long term, I would say, looking at like hard targets, and that's something that's difficult because CIA officers generally, look at their careers, particularly in the field, in like 2 to 3 year increments, right? They're doing tours. And so short term, yeah, they're going to try and get recruitments. There's always the pressure for recruitment of assets for promotions. But then when you're looking at hard targets, that might be a very complex op that takes years, and you may never know the result of what you did years ago. And if it was ever, if the person was ever recruited, because by that time you've lost access to the case because it's restricted handling, right? So I will say that there are lots of, the agency is not afraid to play the long game when it's necessary, right? But then there are also shorter term goals. If there's an important imminent threat, I think the agency can be very nimble when it needs to be. And, we also do cold pitches. If there's, a particularly important target that we know is living in a country that we can't go in and pitch them in, it's too dangerous. If that target is coming out to go to a conference somewhere that, is more palatable, like we could come up with an op like very quickly to get there. And, maybe it's not ideal, a cold pitch, but if done well and by a good officer, it can be successful. And so I think the agency is great at balancing both of those priorities.
Okay. And there's a question about what specifically an asset is.
Okay, so when I say asset, it's also a synonym with agent, and that is a foreign national who has agreed to a clandestine relationship with the CIA and to provide information, foreign intelligence, information of interest to the US's national security. And so we call them a target if it's someone we're interested in developing a relationship with, right? And then there's the recruitment cycle where you're developing the rapport. And by the time we call it pitching for recruitment, it's a very formalized process. You have to get approvals from multiple parts of headquarters before you can do it. But when you do pitch the asset, the person or the target at this point, you are 99% sure that they're going to say yes. We liken it to a marriage proposal. You're not going to propose marriage if you think your partner's going to say no. And so by that point, if you've done it right, the person should say, why didn't you ask me sooner? I was ready months ago. It should be no surprise who you are to them, right? And so then they agree to that relationship, and you will remain their handler while you are on that tour. And then the asset will be turned over to the next handling officer. And an asset is not considered fully recruited until they have gone through a turnover. And that is because some people, you want to avoid an asset who maybe just agrees because of their personal relationship with their first handler, which is very, very important. And an asset will always remember their recruiting agency officer, right? Because they play a very important role for them. But what you don't want is that initial recruiting officer, leaves for their next tour, and then that won't work with anyone else, right? So for it to be a truly recruited asset, it has to go through that we call it a warm turnover. It's a cold turnover if the other case officer has already left and they're not able to like meet together with the asset. So an asset can also be called an agent. And a lot of times people confuse, it's a CIA officer are the CIA employees, and then an agent would be the foreign agent or an asset. But of course, in movies, we use agent for CIA officers. In the book, I call it agents of change because we're all change agents, and it's kind of a fun play on that Hollywood term. But yes, that's an asset. Great question.
Has the term assassination ever been brought up during your time at the CIA?
Is that a question from the chat box?
It's a question from the chat group. Yep.
Okay. Yes, I did work in counterterrorism for a time, and that was particularly hard for me, having been someone who learned African languages because I wanted to join the Peace Corps, to then myself working in counterterrorism. And again, it was brief, it overlapped. I was in the DO working on Somalia. And even though I was in the regional office, of course, I mean, you can't work on Somalia and not then work with your counterterrorism counterparts. And so there was a time that we were, well, there were always different, right, things going on, looking at Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, and particularly Haroon Fazul, the mastermind of the 1998 Dar es Salaam and Nairobi embassy bombings. So it came up in that aspect. And I guess you could argue that if it's going to come up, that's probably the best context because there is a clear like good guy and bad guy, right? Didn't come up in any other sort of conspiratorial context.
Another question is why an asset would be willing to have a relationship with the CIA?
There are a variety of reasons. A lot of people think of money and that's the first one that comes to mind. And I actually think that's one of the least common reasons. And it's probably the one that you want the least because you don't want someone who's just going to take money from the highest bidder, right? So it's usually much deeper than that. Some cooperate out of a deep sense of patriotism. Some, it's ideological. They really believe that by giving this information to the US will be able to, have better policies that will help their country. Lots of different things. There are partly financial, but with like a medical bent. Perhaps they have a health condition. Maybe they have a child with a health condition, and we will help pay for that medical care, which some of that can feel, there's some smarminess to that. But there are different reasons. And so a lot of being a case officer in those early stages of developing rapport and assessing the person for recruitment, you are determining what their vulnerabilities are, what their motivations are. Some people cooperate because they have very big egos and they love hearing that their information was instrumental to my friends back in Washington and, oh, can you please share more, right? Sometimes that is enough for people. So lots of different reasons people do. A lot of it really is because they love their country and they think it's going in the wrong direction and they truly believe the US can help.
So what % of the information you receive tends to be accurate versus inaccurate or made up or?
You certainly come across fabricators, and the agency does a really great job of, having different ways to judge the veracity of reporting, different asset validation techniques. So you have to determine that. So there are different layers of that. So the case officer who is collecting the intelligence and writing it, will go through the DO channels when it's, produced in the system, and they'll kind of add lines, firsthand, secondhand, the access, the veracity, how much they trust the source, all of that. But then it also then falls to the analyst who is the expert in that particular area to then decide how much weight to give that report. And, there's always a concern of fabrication. I will say there's this woman in the book that, joined and spent a lot of the 80s at the agency and unfortunately didn't stay, but then went on to have a very successful career in defense. Her name's Mary Beth Long, and she was a stellar case officer and talks about how headquarters actually sent out officers to have like fireside chats with all of her recruited assets, and she didn't understand what was going on, and later learned that they thought that they were all fabricators because, you know,
Wow.
how did she have so many successful cases? And so again, doubting her abilities, but fabricators do exist, and that's why there are, you know, several layers to hopefully recognize that.
Thank you. What's the most interesting story from your career that you can share with us, please?
I had the wonderful opportunity to travel with two US presidents on their Africa trips. So President George W. Bush and President Obama. And of course, I was behind the scenes doing some sensitive linguistic support. So you wouldn't have seen me in the background on anything. And I was working night shift. And I was out one morning after having worked before going to bed and doing a little shopping in the local market for my kids. And, you know, we all go through the surveillance detection training of like hours of developing routes that you're memorizing every turn, you know, on a 2-hour route, and, you know, including cover stops where you go in for, you know, a certain amount of minutes and out, and then arriving at your decision point within a 2-minute window, right? It's very, very stressful and overwhelming training to prepare you, okay, for this idea that you don't want to bring surveillance to an ops meeting, because if you do, you are putting your asset and their family at risk, and you as well. And so it's something we take very seriously, protecting our assets, because they cooperate with us often at great risk to themselves and their families. So I've gone through all this training. Okay. So fast forward, here I am in Africa on this president's trip, and I'm out in the market, not doing an op, just picking up some trinkets for the kids. And I hear a woman, she's got her like iPhone headphones in like one ear, and she's just sitting in the stall, the little shopping stall. And she's sits right next to me in Swahili, because she doesn't know I can understand. Yes, she's looking at the bags right now. Yes, she's moving to the next stall. And I got such a kick out of this, because it's very rare to actually spot surveillance in the field. I mean, you can talk to lots of case officers and they will tell you, I mean, my husband will even tell you he was never surveilled in the field. There was one instance where he thought surveillance was closing in on him, and there were like security, and ended up thankfully not being for him. But and that's a very entertaining story for another time. But the fact that not only did I have surveillance, but I didn't have to do some like crazy route and look back. They're just going to say that they're following me because they simply think I can't understand them. Was really humorous to me. And you know what? I thought, hey, fantastic. You can watch me shop for my kids all day long, because now you are expending resources on me. And my colleagues are out there actually doing operations, and you're not following them. So, hey, you can accompany me looking at these bags all day long.
Wow. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Fantastic conversation, so insightful. And Anna, great questions. I think Christina and her husband are a pair that would be fun to have dinner with. And
Absolutely.
so that's anyway, let us continue here. On Monday, June 30th, just as a peek ahead, we have John Avlon, the former senior political analyst at CNN, and he's going to share some ideas for renewing New York. So we look forward to that. Again, he also is the current chair of the Citizens Union. This discussion will wrap up our series of events for through June. There's always the possibility that something could happen in Washington or elsewhere that would need to have us bring everyone together again in July. But at least at this moment, we are planning a break for the summer, and we look forward to bringing you a robust list of speakers for the fall. We do have confirmed John Williams, former club chair and CEO of the New York Fed, Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the House, U.S. House Representatives, and Nicola Tangent, the CEO of Norges Bank Investment Management. So we do have already, and hopefully we'll be slotting in as well. I say slotting in Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed. So all of this is something to look forward to as we go forward. as always, before we close, I do want to recognize those joining us today from the nearly 400 members of our Centennial Society, whose generous contributions provide vital support for our club and our programming. So thank you to them, and to everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Christina and Anna, again.
Thank
Great
you so much.
conversation.
Thank you.